Welcome everyone. My name is Joanna and I'm the garden coordinator at the Table Community Food Centre here in Perth. And this is our first live online workshop. Just to give you an update on the situation at the Community Food Centre, we are still continuing our community meals through a takeout. Our food bank is giving out pre-packaged boxes, and our Tuesday food bank hours are now going to switch to delivery only. To continue engaging with everyone involved at the table, we are starting our online live workshops. So today we have the local warm lady with us, and she will teach us all about how to keep a healthy warm bin at home and get nutritious compost in return. Take it away, Gerrie.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. So my name is Gerrie Baker, and I'm fondly known as the Worm Lady, and I'm here today to share with you my passion about earthworms. So I was an organic farmer, and I learned that the very best way to have a healthy organic garden is to employ these beautiful little red wrigglers to convert all of our raw food waste and dead material into nutrient-rich soil. So any kids watching, you know that plants also need to eat. So they don't go to McDonald's or sit at the table with a knife and fork. They get their food from the soil. Trees and plants give us oxygen to breathe, but in order to do that, they need to eat as well. So the way that they do that is the worms convert all dead matter and things like our peelings and our dead food matter that's in our garden or in the house, and they will change that into beautiful, rich soil. So before we get started, I'm going to give you a little quiz. Worms actually have 5 hearts, and they have a very good digestive system. They don't have eyes, but they see through their skin. They don't have ears, but they hear through their skin. And they don't have a nose, but they smell through their tongue. And they don't have teeth, so they depend on decomposers to convert all the dead matter into a nice mushy smoothie. So basically I've come in to the table with old cantaloupe here that the worms have eaten all the outside and the inside, and look what is growing out of this cantaloupe. My goodness, it's a brand new baby cantaloupe. So here is the old seed coat. I don't know if you can see it very clearly there, but basically what's happened is the worms have digested the old cantaloupe, and they are encouraging the new cantaloupe to grow. So it's very, very easy to get started in your home. All you need is a bag of red wrigglers, and keep them warm, keep them moist, make sure that they have air, because just like you and I, they are a breathing, living organism, and you don't want to put them into a container with a tight lid. The other thing is they need calcium carbonate. We're lucky to live right near Anya. And this fine powder is not sodium bicarbonate. It is calcium carbonate. And just the same as you need to have calcium for your nails, your teeth, and your bones, the worms require calcium in order to break down the food in their crop and digest the food. And they also need it for reproduction to make the eggs. So all you need to do is start with any container. It can be wood, glass, metal, or plastic. It does not require a lid. The very best cover is actually a cloth like this. So you want to have it very wet on the bottom, about 50% moisture in the middle, and the top should be very, very dry. The one little tiny problem with a worm bin is sometimes it can create a harvest of little tiny fruit flies. and you don't want fruit flies escaping into your house. So if you have a dry layer of shredded paper on top, that will prevent the fruit flies from coming out. It will also prevent any house flies from going and landing on the food and creating maggots and a mess. So the very best cover is just an old cloth or a towel. You never want to put on a really fixed lid unless it is well ventilated, because what happens is the moisture will start to form underneath and condense and drip back, and your bin could get too wet. If that does happen, all you need to do is take a bunch of dry shredded paper and scrunch it down into the corners to soak up the additional moisture. You definitely do not want the bin to get too dry, because remember that the worms need to always be moist because they breathe through their skin. So, do we have any questions coming in yet, Joanna?
So one question is, could we use eggshells instead of the calcium carbonate that you mentioned?
Thank you for that question, Joanna. Okay, so the calcium carbonate is the same as eggshells. So you don't have to rinse or dry or powder your eggshells. Just put them straight into the bin and the worms will break them down.
Can you tell us a little bit about what we shouldn't be putting into the warm bin?
Excellent question, Joanna. Okay, so inside the house, I would recommend that you don't put in meat and cheese and heavy, dense protein items. They can definitely go into your outside compost. Things like bones and cooked food scraps should not go into your indoor one. So limit the inside one to your waste paper, Kleenexes, paper towel, your shredded newspaper are all carbon material, and then all your food trims.
And do the food trims have to be any specific size? Is it?
Oh, another good question. Joanna's asking if the food trims have to be chopped up, and the answer is, if you want really good success, either chop them really fine or put them into an old blender. So what I like to do is say the worms need a smoothie. So they can't wrap their little mouth around an apple core. They need to have apple sauce. So in the soil, the decomposers are going to break up the apple core and make it all mushy and gushy. But in your kitchen, you want it to already be broke up, either chopped fine or mushed. Now kids can have fun. You can put it into a plastic bag and jump on it. Just make sure it doesn't squirt all over the place. Maybe do that outside. Or you can get an old blender or food processor to puree the food.
And how often should you feed the bin?
You want to feed them at least once a week. Now, having said that, they can go longer if you don't feed them, but the more you feed them, the faster they will digest and the more they will reproduce.
Okay, so what is not safe to give to the worms is a question that just came in, but you covered that with the bones and protein.
The other things might be things like vinegar, alcohol, really heavy spices, things like that I wouldn't add in to the indoor compost.
And is there any point, is there like a point in time when you have to restart your worms?
Oh, definitely. Another good question. It was just asked if the worm bin needs to be restarted when your population is so many. There is a syndrome called habitat collapse that can occur if you have too many worms. So if you look in one day and it's just spaghetti all over the place, there's too many worms, you want to divide your habitat in half. And the easiest way to do that is just simply take another container, make a line through the middle of it, and gently lift half into a new container. And then in the empty side, add a lot of shredded paper and food. Now remember, you never have to add potting soil, And don't bring any leaf matter or grass clippings in from outside. I was told that under one oak leaf, there can be thousands of tiny, tiny microscopic larvae, and you don't want to bring those into your home. However, when you have an excess of worms, you can definitely take them and put them outside into your compost. Okay?
And are those, when we put them outside in our compost, will they overwinter in our compost?
Definitely. The question now is, will they overwinter? They will go down as soon as they smell the frost coming. They will go down below the frost line and they will come back up again. So there's no worry about putting them out in the summertime. I wouldn't start them outside right now. It's still a little bit too cold, and don't put them out after the end of October. But anytime through the summer, you can start a habitat outside. Now, just remember, there's lots of predators outside because snakes, skunks, raccoons, frogs, everything love to go to your compost and eat your compost for their dinner, and they'll eat your worms for dessert. So moles are particularly bad for cleaning up a lot of worms in one night. So I always suggest to people that you get a really strong indoor habitat going and then put your excess worms out into the very center of your outdoor composter. And if you have a dog, or you can walk around your compost a lot to keep the predators away.
Is there ever a point at which you have to add manure to your bin?
No. Outside, worms will digest all of your manure. They love animal feces. Some people even have an indoor toilet, and the worms will digest human manure. But don't add manure into an indoor bin. Keep all your outside material out in your garden, and then you can put the excess out there. I see Robin has asked about coffee grounds, and that's a really good point. You can compost all your coffee grounds, all your tea leaves, and that is a carbon matter. So when you're thinking about your habitat, think of your C to N ratio, and that's carbon to nitrogen. And you want more carbon material than nitrogen material. I said earlier that this is an aerobic process. They need air. You don't want to put a tight lid on them. So just keep in mind that if you put just food waste, it could start to get very dense and heavy and become anaerobic and stinky. So the key to keeping your worm bin fresh is to make sure that you have a lot of carbon material. So coffee grounds, tea leaves, your shredded paper is essential to a healthy worm bin so that it stays very porous.
And what if I had a greenhouse, a poly greenhouse,
Yes.
and I wanted to bury the bins in the ground? Would that be a good environment for them to overwinter in?
I wouldn't do that. So rather than bury a bin, which limits how far down they can go, I would simply just put them outside in a protected but an open bottom area. As long as you keep feeding them in your compost, you will have worms in the spring. It's kind of faith, but they will be there in the spring. And if you bury a plastic bin, that's going to limit how deep they can go.
And where would you suggest we keep the bin in our house?
Inside, I would say that the best place is in the basement. If you have a basement, you might want to put a board underneath it so that water doesn't come up through your basement floor. You want to have them off the cold floor. And I would say keep a light on them, because believe it or not, they can crawl up the sides of the bins, but they will go back down because they have that photosensitive skin. They'll go back down if there's a light on them. You can keep them under your sink. Some people have them in their bathroom. Anywhere at all, as long as it's warm and there is some light.
Okay, and how about collecting the castings? How long does it take to get the castings and how would we collect them?
Okay, so this question is, how long does it take them to make castings? Well, if you puree the food and you have a very active habitat, the worms will puree their weight every week. So if you have a pound of worms, they can handle a pound of compost every week. They'll be even faster than that if it's really moist and really warm. And honestly, I feed the worms one day and go back the next day and it's all gone. So as long as it's a mushy, warm, moist puree, they will come up and eat it very quickly and convert it into castings. I usually feed them once a week. And the best way to collect the castings, I see that's the next question, is to simply shine a bright light on them. So sometimes you've seen ant hills, and worms are the same. They go up and they grab the food matter, they pull it down into their tunnels, and they convert it, and then they push the castings to the top. They live in the middle layer. They go down to breed in the very, very damp, swampy bottom of your bin, but they're always pushing the castings to the top. So if you put a bright light on them, they are going to go down to the very bottom. And then I just like to hand remove the castings very gently. You might get still some chunks of eggshell or bits of paper in with it, but most of your worms will be on the bottom.
And should you have drainage holes in your bin?
Drainage or no drainage. So if you want to collect this lovely black nutrient tea, it's called, you can have a drainage hole in one corner of your bin and put a large sealer or glass jar. So you've got a sight glass and see how that's filling up so it doesn't overdrain. Or you can put one bin into another. Some people do that. They'll put a block of wood in the bin and have one bin elevated over top of the other and catch all that lovely black nutrient tea. Now that is very, very powerful. You can dilute it 100-to-1, and you can do a foliar spray by misting your plants. They absorb the nutrient through their leaf, or you can water it in, or you can root zone, soak it, and let them drink up the nutrient. I personally, in the house, do not have holes in the bin because sometimes they leak and it gets on the floor. And rather than that, I just keep it the right moisture. So for me, that's the best. But if it's in the basement and you want to have the double bin system or a drainage hole in one corner, that's up to you. So are there more questions? All right, well, if that's a wrap, I don't know.
Maybe we'll give it a couple more minutes to see if there are any questions coming in.
Okay. And just remember, it's very simple. Okay, this is nature working at its best. It's been doing it for centuries, taking our dead material and converting it into beautiful soil and nutrient for the trees. Anna's called in saying, how do you use the casting? Yes, you can mix it in potting soil. And is there a recommended mix? Okay, well, Anne, really, it's up to you. The castings are so gentle that you can actually germinate seeds right in it. So some of my very, very best plants have come as volunteers out of the worm bin. So you can see right here, I think this is either a mango or an avocado that has started growing. And obviously this one that's in the cantaloupe skin is a cantaloupe growing. So I have had Moon and Stars watermelon that have germinated right in the bin, and they have been the finest watermelon that I've ever grown. Without planting the seeds. They were just seeds from a little watermelon. But everything will germinate wonderful in the very gentle castings. However, having said that, they're extremely strong. So if you have a diseased or a dying plant, just take about 1 tablespoonful of the lovely black compost and sprinkle that around the top of your plant. And very often it will completely revive just with a little bit of worm casting. I can't tell you how many times on the farm I saw a plant that was loaded with aphids or tomato hornworm or something, and I just grabbed it and said, "You gotta go," and threw it into the compost without thinking. And 2 weeks later, I'd come back to see it there in full bloom. I remember once I pulled out almost a whole row of eggplants. They had beautiful purple blossoms and just loaded with aphids, and I just didn't have the time to knock aphids off, and I thought, nah, into the compost with you guys. And I had gorgeous big blackish purple eggplants off of those plants that I discarded because they were so full of bugs. But the key that I learned was in the compost, there was the right environment for those plants to get the nutrient that they needed, set those blossoms into lovely big fruits, and that's where the eggplants came from. So for the children that are maybe watching, I want you to know that this is the great mysterious circle of life. So when a bird is alive, the bird is going to go and eat the worm. But when the bird dies, the worms are going to come up and digest the bird and convert it into soil. So it is the wonderful circle of life. That's what happens. And if your parents aren't watching, you can say to them, what does a worm and a bird have in common? And your parents are going to shake their head and go, a bird and a worm, there's nothing in common. Yes, there is. Birds don't have teeth, and neither does a worm. Both birds and worms have a crop. And in this little crop, it's like a grinder. They pick up stones, and the worms use the calcium in their crop to grind down their food and convert it. And guess what else? Both birds and worms lay eggs. Okay, so 3 things. They don't have teeth, they both have a crop, and they both lay eggs. That's just a little fun fact.
Great. So Gerrie, Anne is asking again about using the castings in her house plant.
Oh yes, definitely. You can use them in the garden, you can mix them in your garden soil, but definitely on your house plants. And every bit of that wonderful, wonderful black earth or humus or castings is going to have baby worms in it. So when the worms hatch out of their egg capsule, which is very, very tiny, there can be a lot of baby earthworms come out of one egg, and they're no larger than your eyelash. So you will find that your house plants will actually have a worm habitat going right in them. All my house plants have worms living in them. So the worms don't only convert material and change it to soil for the plants, they also aerate. And the other thing I've learned is that plants require air at their root zone even more than water. The most common thing that we do is we kill our plants with too much water. So a very loose, humus, friable soil is way better than sitting in water. So as the worms are going up and down in your house plants, they're aerating it, and your plants will be way more healthy with castings and worms right in them. Now sometimes I'll put tea leaves around my plants in the house, And I know the worms are there because they come up and very quickly the tea leaves are gone, or coffee grinds right in your houseplants. Okay?
So how will if you don't put tea leaves, how long can the worms be in the houseplant?
That's a good question. They seem to last forever. If you don't feed it, your plants are always going to have a few dead roots. When you pull a plant out, there's beautiful white roots, and then there's dark brown roots, and the worms will actually go and clean up all of the brown, rotting, dying roots in the plant. And your plant drops a leaf once in a while. So the worms will thrive right in your plants.
And what happens if I go away for 2 weeks and can't take my worm bin with me? Do I have to have someone look after them?
No, definitely not. I had a soldier that went over to Afghanistan for a 3-month tour, and it ended up he did a double tour. He was away for a whole 6 months, and he came back, thank God, and his worm bin was left in his bathtub with about a gallon of mushy gushy food. And the first thing he told me he did when he walked in his front door was he went and he checked on his worms in the bathtub, and they were fine. So he left them very wet, sitting in his bathtub in his apartment. After 6 months, they were still doing fine. Also, if they dry out and you think, oh, I've ruined it, they're dried out, I didn't take care of it. If you water it again, the worm eggs will very often survive a drought. The worms themselves might all be gone and turn to dust, but the eggs themselves seem to be able to withstand a drought and a deep freeze. I have had bins that froze solid, and I know they were solid as rock, and yet in the spring, those worm eggs woke up and was back to normal. Of course, the adults became wormsicles, but the eggs can survive.
So would you say that the worms can take drought better than being too wet? Because I've had
both. That's a hard question to answer. I would say they're better off wet than dry. Okay, drying them out is cruelty. If they're wet, they can usually come to the top. So at Ottawa University, they had worms in the lab, and they kept watering them, and I went in there and it was a stinky, anaerobic, horrible mess. They had tight lids on them and they were wet, and it was just disgusting going into this lab. But the bins were just full on the top with worms swimming. So I just put a clothes peg on my nose and emptied it all out and sloshed all the muck away. And I was there for 3 days. And by the 3rd day, all the smell was gone and the worms were into digesting more recycled paper. So even if your worm bin turns anaerobic for a day or so, it can be restarted. The key is to keep it at about 50% moisture. And the way I like to describe that is if you take the soil from your worm bin and you squeeze it, it will hold its shape, okay? So you can see it's not falling apart like sand, and it's also not dripping like a swamp. So just remember that the very, very bottom of your bin should be swamp-like, because that's where they're going to hook together. They're going to go down to the swamp, mate, lay their eggs, and then the top should be very dry. Now, when you feed, you do not have to stir the food in. Just pull back your dry paper, pour your food over the top, and cover it again with dry paper. What I like to do sometimes is I'll feed in this corner, and the next day in this corner, and the next day in this corner, and this corner, and then I say that gives them exercise. They can travel around the bin eating, and they do. They can smell where the fresh food is, and they will go to it. So that's another good way to divide them. If you just want castings, what I'll sometimes do is I'll put a whole bunch of pureed food in one side of the bin and wait for a week or so. And the majority of the worms are going to move to the fresh food source, and then I can just pull cast off the other side.
And when would you know, how would you tell that you need to divide your colony? Wendy was asking, she tuned in a little.
Okay,
later,
so
yeah.
Somebody also asked how long the worm factory's been going on. It was actually started in 1981, right here in the Perth area. Now somebody's asking where to get worms. You can get them from me, the worm lady. Always order the little red wrigglers. Don't try to do indoor composting with the big night crawlers or Lubriticus or Hortensis, all those other species. There's many, many species of earthworms, but the best ones are the little red wrigglers. So what was your question, Joanna?
How do you know that you have to split your colony?
Okay, so observation. When you look in and there's just too many worms, they'll look like spaghetti in there, then definitely split right away, because there is this syndrome called habitat collapse where about 90% of them will die off, 10% will digest the rest, and your bin will keep going. But instead of having this plethora of worms, you're only going to have a few worms and a whole bunch of castings. So don't let that happen. Divide before you've got so many worms that you can't see soil.
Great. So as you mentioned before, we could put these worms outside in our compost pile?
Absolutely. They can go outside. You don't want to put them in your garden. You want them to go into an outside compost. And I believe the very best compost is a hole in the ground. So if you're planning on starting a fruit tree or blueberry bushes or something, plan where you're going to plant your trees or your bushes. Dig a hole and do your composting right in those holes. So you can add worms right into those holes, mound the soil up over top of it. Very, very quickly, the soil is going to go right back down to the level of the ground. And that hole that you've been composting in for 4 to 6 months, even a year, is going to be so beautiful that when you put your apple whip or a fruit bush or anything into it, you don't even have to use a shovel to dig it. You can just reach in with your hand, put your bare root in there, and it's guaranteed to live and do well. So a hole in the ground, to me, is far better than these plastic humped black garbage composters. But if you do have one of those, please keep in mind how much water the worms need. And instead of leaving this domed composter, flip that dome over so that it's like a bird bath. Drill holes in it so any water that's collected will go into your compost and help break down the food and water the worms. And you can just use a shot cord or those cords with the hooks on them and hook it on the rim and bring it down and hook it onto the slits of your black composters.
And I guess it's important to keep them out of direct sun. Did we talk about that?
Yes, definitely. You don't want them getting too hot. Brian and Melanie, they're asking where to get worms. You can contact me at 613-583-7509 or through the table. Joanna here at the table knows how to get hold of me.
Yes, of course. Great. Well, those were some really great questions. And
Brian is saying at the table garden we have large compost piles. Can I just add worms on top of the pile? Okay, so when you add worms to your outside compost, you want to dig a hole in the center, use a long pole and make a hole right in the center. Water it really well. And I like to remind people not to use ice cold well water, because if you were a worm about to mate or digest your dinner and you got this icy cold shower, all you would think of is fall is coming and go down. So water with warm water, and the same if you have chlorinated water in town. What I recommend is you put water out in buckets, let the chlorine evaporate off, let the water warm up. I used to use the big 5-gallon pails and just fill them with the ice cold well water, let them warm up, then dump them into the very center of your outdoor compost pile, and then add your worms directly into the center and cover them over really well. Keeping in mind again that raccoons and skunks and moles and snakes are going to come and feast on them. So just a little aside, when I design a garden, I do it like a circle or a wagon wheel. And I put compost as king right in the very center of the garden, and then the rows radiating off of the axle. That way, I don't have so far to go to put compost in. As well, you get this beautiful leachate that runs down the rows into your garden. Many people compost behind the garage, under the lilac tree, and the most nutrient-rich part of their yard is that waste area behind the garage. So that's where the raccoons and skunks and sometimes even bears will go to eat your compost. So bring your compost forward into the very center where you want to plant a tree or make your garden around your compost, whatever you like. Anyway.
Very good. Well, those were some really good questions.
All right. I'm available anytime. You can email me at worm.education@gmail.com. I think that's it. Worm.education. Joanna's got it. All right, thanks, bye.
Thanks, Gerrie. Yes, we'll post Gerrie's information on our page. And thanks, everyone, for watching. And stay tuned for our next session coming to you sometime soon. Thank you. Oh my God.
I'm trying to read and look at you and answer questions.
I know, and I thought I could